Biologists are always out there in the woods, in the lakes and rivers across the North Country working to help certain animal populations that may be in danger due to human pollution or climatic conditions or whatever. An important part of that work is to assess whether it's working and adapt accordingly. On a tributary to Lake Champlain, biologists are taking a novel approach to figure out if their efforts to help the native salmon population are working. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Morja Wealth Management, serving the North Country for 3 generations. MorjaWM.com. Securities offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower is an SEC-registered investment advisor. And Kinney Drugs, whose pharmacists offer routine seasonal vaccines for older adults, including senior dose influenza, COVID, RSV, and pneumonia. Details at KinneyDrugs.com.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Tuesday, September 23rd. First up, firefighters continue to battle an underground bog fire at the Alvin Runnels Forest, about 20 miles north of the St. Lawrence River in Ontario. The township of North Dundas says this afternoon that progress is being made to bring things under control, thanks to a combination of fire breaks, rainfall, and firefighting efforts. The 100-acre blaze has been contained to parts of the forest. Officials say crews are closing in on having the fire under control. The whole region is experiencing severe drought, despite the recent rainfall last night and today. Essex County extended its burn ban yesterday, citing the dry conditions. A museum in the Adirondacks is facing criticism after auctioning off more than a dozen historic boats. Staff at the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake say the boats weren't made in the park and were in poor condition. But a former curator and museum director are both critical of the move. Pat Bradley reports for the New York Public News Network.
The museum in the Adirondacks recently auctioned 16 boats in its collection, including some from the 19th century. Hallie Bond was the museum's curator from 1983 to 2012 and is considered an expert in historic small Adirondack boats.
They're all different. They all have different stories to tell about how they were used and why they were chosen for that kind of use.
Bond says she broadened the collection to include historically significant boats from outside the Adirondacks.
That whole understanding of the significance of the boat collection was not considered. Several of the boats, I suppose, were deaccessioned because they were not made and used in the Adirondacks.
Craig Gilborn was the museum's director from 1972 to 1992 and is the former president of the New York State Association of Museums. He calls the $30,000 the museum netted from the auction a pittance in light of their actual value.
Ms. Bond wrote the book on the boat collection, but the museum did not consult her about the disposal of any of that collection. $30,000 is chicken feed.
Bond is concerned that the sale sends the wrong message to potential donors and appears to show a superficial appreciation of the historic significance of the boats.
Several of the boats that were deaccessioned, I think, were important to the collection. And if they needed that space, there were other options.
Some critics of the sale are concerned that scholars will no longer be able to study the boats. Bond recalls that people would come to the museum to do research.
When I was there, we had builders come to look at tools as well as the boats themselves. We had scholars. We had lots of enthusiasts who come in and would see the exhibit, but then we also, of course, have this wonderful research collection that they could then go into and compare these different types of boats and wonder about why a builder did this rather than that boat over there. You know, when I was in museum school, we were taught to think that objects in a history museum are just like books in a library. You know, you can refer to them and they have things to tell you.
In an email to WAMC, Adirondack Experience Communications Director Tara Murphy says that the decision was made to auction several boats because they, quote, were not made or used in the Adirondacks, are duplicates, and or in poor condition, unquote. Murphy notes that the museum has added 25 historic boats over the past decade and now has its largest ever collection, totaling 260. The most recent acquisition is an 1870s guideboat that, quote, at 19 feet long, it is the earliest example of a large freight-style guideboat in our collection and may be the earliest surviving example anywhere, unquote. In Plattsburgh, I'm Pat Bradley for the New York Public News Network.
State and federal agencies on both sides of Lake Champlain have worked for decades to restore its native landlocked salmon population. As Kara Chapman reports, they're trying something new to figure out what management strategies work best in one of the lake's major tributaries.
A lot of work's been done in recent years to make the Boquet River more welcoming to Atlantic salmon. The removal of the Willsboro Dam, habitat restoration, improved passage structures. But it's been difficult to figure out whether all that effort, on top of stocking, is bearing fruit, or fry, if you will. Rob Fiorentino with the State Department of Environmental Conservation says that comes down to the tools used to collect and sample adult salmon returning to the Boquet to spawn.
We use these things called hoop nets. They're basically a string of hoops with a net wrapped around them, and we put those out there, and then we monitor them, and when we see there's fish in them, we'll go get those fish, collect those fish out of the nets, collect our sample, get our measurements, and let the fish go.
It's a pretty labor and time-intensive process. Staff with the DEC and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have to wear dry suits as they make their way into the cold fall water, and that's if conditions are even safe enough for them to go out in the first place. Plus, the hoop net misses fish making their way upriver. That makes it hard to get an accurate picture of exactly how many are returning, but also what salmon stocking strategies are actually working. So, the DEC and the Wildlife Service are trying something different. Fiorentino says they've installed what's called a resistance board weir.
A staff member that was reviewing the project called it a fence for fish.
That fence spans the width of the river between private and Willsboro-owned land. The structure is hooked to the river bottom, and it's made of PVC pipes that are spaced out to allow smaller fish to swim through. But not adult Atlantic salmon. They have to swim up and down the weir until they find a small-necked funnel that brings them into a larger trap.
And because the weir is going across the entire river, we know we're going to get all of the salmon.
The trap is located on the edge of the river. That means it's accessible for the staff. They'll check it daily, collect data on the trapped salmon, and release them above the weir to continue upriver. Staff will take a genetic sample from each salmon's caudal or tail fin. Each of those carries a wealth of information. It can tell the agencies whether the salmon are wild or stocked, and Fiorentino says where the stocked fish were put into the system and at what phase of life.
And what that's allowing us to do is have a greater understanding of how and what we're stocking is surviving within the lake to, one, create a lake fishery, and then two, come back as a spawning adult in the fall in these tributaries such as the Saranac and the Boquet.
Currently, the DEC is just stocking smolt in the Boquet. Smolt are young salmon getting ready to go out into the lake. It's at this age that they imprint on their source water, so the idea and the hope is that they'll return there to spawn. Fiorentino says the smolt are being stocked at 3 different distances from the mouth of the Boquet River.
We're hoping that, we will see one group at a higher return rate than the others, which will help us, let's dig in a little bit more into this group, and also let's adjust our stocking methodology.
This focus on salmon spawning in the Boquet River is part of a much bigger picture. There's the decades-long effort at the local, state, and federal levels to restore native species to Lake Champlain, but also the huge economic impact that a popular sport fish like salmon brings to the region. Fiorentino says government agencies and nonprofits want to see results from all the work they've put in.
So this is just, a next step progression. It's like, all right, we need to improve our returns. Okay, how do we do that? All right, we got to get more samples to figure out what's working better than what's not. Is that working at all? Sometimes it's hard for us to collect that data. So that's where it comes in. That's where it becomes key.
Right now, the weir is in place and ready to catch fish in the Boquet River. Sampling will continue until the end of November. At that point, staff will take the weir out and store it until next year. The plan is to repeat this process, collecting data on returning salmon each fall for the next 5 years. Kara Chapman, North Country Public Radio.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Caitlin Scholl of Lake Placid and Hank Soto of Stony Creek. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.